In an instant, 4 Florida construction workers are trapped in a collapsed trench. As the sandy, wet soil comes crashing down, their co-workers fight desperately to unearth them before they suffocate. On November 7th, 1996, Floyd was working on a water and sewer trench, about 5 feet wide, 30 feet long, and over 12 feet deep. Bogan needed to install the pipe in the trench quickly. Loose sand from the walls continued to refill the trench. Because they were so close to sea level, groundwater seeped into the trench. In a matter of seconds, trench workers were buried under hundreds of cubic yards of sand and soil. The force that hit them was equal to being run over by a pickup truck.
Where are the others at?
Only Don Price could be seen above the rubble. Risking their own lives, the backhoe operator and his co-worker quickly freed him. Though his ankle was broken, Price raced to get to stable ground. The workers continued to search for the 3 men who were still buried. Suffocation would take place in the next 3 minutes.
Margate 911, do you have an emergency?
The construction foreman called 911 from a nearby office.
The address there. P951
The dispatcher relayed the call to the nearest rescue unit. The Margate Fire Rescue Station responded to the urgent call. 1 minute had gone by since the collapse. The men were still buried.
Floyd, are you there?
The backhoe operator uncovered the arm of one of the men from under the dirt. It was Floyd Bogan. He was barely conscious. The pressure on his chest was so great he couldn't expand his lungs to breathe. The men continued to search desperately for the other 2 workers. They soon realized that it wasn't just sand and dirt that had fallen, but a huge van-sized coral boulder had rolled over on the men. Bogan's left leg was pinned beneath the massive rock. After more digging, they found another worker. It was Cleo Brizuela. He was bleeding from the mouth, badly crushed, yet remarkably alive. He too was having trouble breathing. Though 2 of the men were now exposed, all 3 were still trapped under the massive boulder. The tremendous weight of the soil prevented Bogan and Brizuela from breathing. Although their heads were above ground, they were slowly suffocating. As rescue leader Rob Davis arrived, he saw that the trench walls still posed a considerable threat to any rescue attempt.
I had asked the other co-workers who were digging the patients out to please stop what you're doing. We'll take over from here. Please leave the trench at this time, which they did. I asked him, where are you hurt? What's going on? He says, I can't breathe. And I kept asking. His main response was, please don't let me die. Please don't let me die. And I said, I'm here. Don't worry, calm down, and we'll get you out of here. I'm not going anywhere.
The rescue team checked the 2 trapped men as they looked for the 3rd. It had now been 8 minutes since the collapse. If there was any chance of still saving Escobar, they'd have to find him quickly. Paramedic Louis Villard needed to stabilize Brizuela. The blood from his mouth likely meant he had internal bleeding.
Psychologically, you have to help the individuals not lose hope, because then the outcome becomes worse. I reassured him that I would do everything in my power to get him out of there safe and sound.
Finally, they located Escobar. He was below Bogan, tangled in his feet.
As I looked to my left, just below him, there was a huge void. And you can look in there and you can see water and gravel, and that's where you saw the third victim.
Ty, we got a third victim. Signal set.
He was deceased. He was looking back at me, and it almost appeared like he was almost snapped in half. So it was a tough scene.
The rescue workers were at the mercy of the unstable trench.
As we were digging out, it was like you're digging muck, but we were in the water table, and for every scoop I took out, it's like 3 scoops would fall back in, and it was like I wasn't getting anywhere.
Without any shoring in the trench, the possibility of a second collapse was high. The rescue workers immediately set to work, determined that the trench would not consume the 2 men who were still clinging to life. Plywood, 2x4s, everything they could put their hands on was commandeered in order to buttress the unstable walls. But they couldn't get a stable support base.
We determined that the backboards were going to be somewhat helpful, but we also determined once there was a boulder and once we kept seeing dirt trickling down, that the backboards were not going to do the job, and we definitely needed a technical rescue team out here immediately, and that's when I made the call for them to respond.
Okay, let them know we're going to get them out of here, okay?
He did say something that was kind of bone chilling when you have a person there that you're talking to and you're telling you're going to rescue, and the guy tells you, listen, I know I'm dead. Just let me go. Leave me alone. Pretty much let me die in peace. That's when you increase your efforts and you make sure that you let him know that you're doing everything and he's going to be fine. And that's what we did.
When he finally freed the leg, he discovered it was actually Escobar's. The deceased man was entangled with Bogan.
LT, we got a lot of water down here. A lot more water.
The water level started to rise, which was complicating the situation with the victims. Every effort that we made, water and mud would continue to fill up the holes. But we were afraid of them drowning.
The rescue team had to pump the water out of the trench. The technical rescue teams arrived on the scene. They were trained to perform special operations like bridge rescues and trench collapses. The first order of business was to get new bracing in place while paramedics attended to the injured.
Well, the problem with the shoring that was first put into the trench is it wasn't supported, it wasn't the right material to be used. If something had moved, it would have blown it right apart and never would have held up.
To prevent worker fatigue, they began to change out the paramedics.
They had asked me to leave the trench. I was soaking wet, and I was tired. But again, my adrenaline, my enthusiasm, I was kind of bummed when I had to leave because I wanted to stay there. But again, they needed to get some fresh personnel in there. And I want to say probably within the next hour, I got called back to help with the shoring.
Well, the type of plywood that we used is very hard, very heavy. It has a resin coating on it to protect it from water and from the soil. On that plywood, we attach a 2x12. We put the panels in on both sides with the strong back, so those boards facing each other on the inside. Now we have a nailing surface that we can secure the strut to.
In addition to the wood structure, they used hydraulic bracing that would apply continuous outward pressure, even if the sand eroded away behind the boards. The technical rescue teams finally got the new bracing in place. They'd solved one problem. Now the real work would begin.
One victim was vomiting blood and whatever contents he had in his system. This individual was getting ready to give up.
As it started to get dark, the rescue team set up generator-powered lights. Elise Bogan, informed of the trench collapse, rushed to the scene. she desperately feared for her husband's life.
I could tell you from the rescuer's point of view, one of the hardest things on a long-term incident, when the incident goes for a long period of time, is fatigue of the rescuers. Most of our emergencies, last 15 or so minutes or less. And when the scope of the incident, when the timeline of the incident stretches into the 6-hour mark, fatigue starts to take place.
With the media hovering at the scene, Chief Garrison Westbrook realized they were faced with an additional hindrance.
When the helicopters arrived, there's approximately 6 or 7 networks in this area. This is a fairly metropolitan area, and all of them had their helicopters at the scene. At one time, I believe we had 5 units up in the sky. Now, they were getting as close as possible for their cameras, and they were very loud. If you've ever heard a helicopter, you can imagine what 4 or 5 sound like. And at that point, after about 10 minutes time, we couldn't even communicate on our radios because of the noise.
As the paramedics tended to the patients, conditions in the trench worsened.
Water was certainly a concern. They had been essentially submerged in water for hours. Their will to live was diminishing with every minute, so we had to try to get them out of there as best we could.
To prevent hypothermia and raise the patient's body temperatures, they wrapped the trapped men in protective plastic blankets.
We've gone through 3, 4, 5 different plans and nothing was working. It was getting late, it was getting dark. It's a very frustrating feeling. I'm trying to think of a tool that we'd use to cut the metal bar the patient's leg was wrapped around. Knew we couldn't use an electric tool because it was underwater, and hydraulic cutters would be too dangerous because his leg was wrapped around it as well. So I'm trying to think of a tool that would be small enough to get in there. So a pneumatic air chisel was the tool of choice. It just came to my mind, hey, I need an air chisel in here.
The TRT members decided that if they couldn't move the entire boulder, they'd move it piece by piece. The rescuers had to chip away the solid rock, which was right next to Cleo Brizuela. With only one chisel, they would have to wait to see if it worked before attempting to free Floyd Bogan. The rescuers did all they could to keep the trapped men awake and alert. They suspected Brizuela was bleeding internally. They gave him 2 liters of whole blood as the rescue team used the air chisel to get him out.
Well, there's a rule that if there's 15 minutes of entrapment, 10 to 15 minutes of entrapment, you consider a more rapid transport. So after the first 10 minutes, when it was clear that we weren't going to be able to unearth these people with shovels and with our bare hands, we knew that the aircraft response would be critical for this situation.
It was slow going. They were able to chip away only small pieces of the boulder. At last, Brizuela was free. The helicopter landed as close as it could, but it was still a quarter-mile away. In order to keep the patient stable, they loaded him into a waiting ambulance. After 5 long hours in the trench, Brizuela was now only 10 minutes away from the medical treatment he needed. He was hypothermic and had internal injuries.
The helicopter took the first patient to the trauma center, and we asked for a rapid turnaround of the helicopter to come retrieve the second patient.
The rescuers soon discovered they would have to work upside down and underwater to get the last man free. But just as they were getting close to releasing him, the rescuers were faced with a new obstacle. they discovered that a steel pipe blocked their path. More of the rock would then have to be removed to pull his leg up and over.
Well, the first thing we had to do was cut away the steel pipe that he was wrapped around, a chip at a time on the steel pipe, and then once I did that, we got a hose line in there and moved some more soil, and then used the air chisel not on the steel but on the rock itself.
Piece by piece, the rock began to give way. Fatigue was setting in, and they urged him not to give up. Lieutenant Robert Herschel coordinated the efforts.
Getting him out of the trench took a lot of work. Using an air chisel to chip away enough of the rock and a fire hose to blow away some of the material away from his leg. And it just took a brute force and just a lot of manipulation of his leg and trying to get enough material away from his extremity that we could get him out of there. And he complained, he screamed, but I felt his foot was loose and his leg, and it was just, just grab it and go. Just pull as hard as you can to get him out of there.
Finally, Bogan felt his leg slip loose. He was free.
It probably took an hour and a half once we got the air chisel in there to get him out. It wasn't a speedy process. You can't see where you're working, so you're just going by feel. You're almost upside down in this hole, trying to work.
The paramedics brought in a half-back extrication harness. Between the pull on the harness and the men working in the trench, they were able to lift Bogan up and out from under the boulder. To stabilize him, they placed him on a backboard and secured it to a Stokes basket. He was covered in blood and suffering from excruciating pain. After being trapped for hours, Floyd Bogan was finally freed from the trench.
Just bring him down. Just get 4 corners. There you go.
He was suffering from a concussion, and he complained of extreme back and leg pain. He was hypothermic, and they needed to raise his body temperature as soon as possible. The combined efforts of the Margate Fire Rescue Department, along with the Broward County and Fort Lauderdale Technical Rescue Teams, over 70 people altogether, proved that even the most precarious situations can be overcome with ingenuity and tenacity. 2 men owe their lives to their efforts.
It's a call that'll stay with me a lifetime, and that's why I got into the business, to run the calls and to make a difference and to save lives.
Floyd Bogan and Cleo Brizuela both recovered. They still suffer from permanent injuries from the accident. Don Price was treated at the hospital that day and released. The body of Oscar Escobar was exhumed later that night.